Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and I've got a bin that I want to check in on today. It's a bin of African night crawlers. It's the oldest of my bins, which for the past 10 days now has been undergoing what I refer to as horizontal migration. My oldest bin is up here on the top left corner, and then I kind of start wrapping around and going downwards and across, back and forth, zigzagging in terms of putting the oldest bin up here, and then as you work your way down you get to younger and younger bins. So this bin here has been now doing what I refer to as migrating for the past 10 days. I had set up some food in here to get the worms to come over to that area, hence the name migrating. And prior to migrating, what I did was, obviously I was composting in this for weeks and weeks, maybe months. And then at some point prior to initiating this migration, I had done what I refer to as foraging. And that's actually the stage that this bin right here is in. So in here, it's just kind of business as usual. Worms are doing their thing, just no fresh food. If you keep going over here to a bin that's yet a little younger, here we're still kind of actively composting, probably at the 12th or 13th feeding. Here I had stopped feeding after feeding number 15, and here too. Feeding number 15 went for a while, 3 weeks of foraging, and now this most recent feeding is actually counted as number 16 in a way. But this is where we're going to check in. We'll bring it over to the bench so we've got a little bit more light and easier access, and we'll see how this migration's coming along. Clearly the first thing you notice when you come into this bin is a couple dried worms that somehow got up on top of that piece of cardboard and didn't figure out in time that they're just going to dry out there. I can never figure that out. It's something I usually don't even see in my bins, but most recently it seems like I've been observing that in a number of my bins. I'm sure it means something, but so far I've just been kind of going with the flow and not treating it as a big deal, but it is a little bit unusual. Here, I don't mind worms hanging out on the top surface because underneath that plastic we've had a nice amount of moisture circulating right there. So it's no surprise that the worms have come out to enjoy a little bit of that fresh moisture collecting there under the plastic. The stuff underneath here that's providing moisture is actually 3 layers of bedding and food. 3 layers of food, really. During last week's video, we laid in some cucumber bits, some banana peels, some coffee, a variety of different things, and then I think somebody even came into my comments section about that video later and started suggesting that I should probably put something sweet in there, like a piece of melon rind. So, I had forgotten that I'd used banana and other sweet things when I built the feeding zone, so I figured why not, let's enhance it a little bit with something sweet, having forgotten that I'd already used something sweet. And I came in here after hours, after the bin had been running for a few hours already, and I came in here and I even added more food, which was these 2 pieces of cantaloupe rind. And you can see I don't know if there's a third piece here. You can see the rind clearly, but I bet you, if you try to pick the thing up, it's just like a sheet of paper. It's paper thin. All the meaty fruit has been skimmed off and eaten. Not too surprising. And this stuff, they'll eat that too in time. It's not too surprising that they've come in and taken advantage of the best stuff, easiest to eat. So now, I guess the easiest way to get a little view into how our feeding zone is progressing in terms of luring worms over from the finished compost, we have to pick through it a little bit. Picking through it a little bit will also let me know if I've got to go up to the kitchen and bring some more food down to keep this process going. Even before we see what's in this feeding zone in terms of worm turnout, I'm just going to state that I'm not in any position right now to migrate worms out and move them. My only aim here today was to see if after 10 days, whether the moisture levels in here are decent, which they are, and if the food supplies are holding up, which I don't know yet. We can certainly see that as far as the melon goes, there's no leftovers. And my idea with that was that, you know, the worms might be cruising the surface and sense that out there near the top, come on over for the melon, and then eventually realize that, hey, the moisture is recirculating over in this area, the food supply is here, because if they go down another layer they'll find even more food besides the melon. So hopefully a lot of worms have turned out for this feeding area, and hopefully they've come out and stayed. Just trying to figure out what I did here. Usually I just lay in sort of a little piece of cardboard with a whole bunch of holes punched through it so that worms can get around it and through it. And it's not meant to serve as a barrier, it's just kind of a visual aid for me to be able to tell, you know, where the finished castings and where the feeding area are relative to each other. Try to limit the mixing here, because at some point this is really just going to end up being, you know, finished compost here, and all this is going to get hauled out, relocated. So it would be nice to kind of keep them separate, since they're totally headed in different directions. So I guess we'll protect the finished compost underneath that cardboard, just to give us an opportunity to peek into here, see how many worms we managed to pull together, and how the food supply in here is holding out. There's a good amount of bedding in here, which is still a little bit dry, but I assume it was chunks of food right nearby that got the worms to come over and hang out there. Whether there's leftovers of that food, this right here I believe would be a piece of banana peel. The only piece that I think that I would expect to find in here as far as leftovers. The other stuff that I remember feeding, stuff like cucumber bits, I would have to assume we're not going to see any remnant of in here. I know, everyone's probably thinking to themselves, geez, the worms are in your hand, dude. Move them into a new space. It's very tempting to do so. There's certainly no reason I couldn't. But like I said, my aim here today was just to make sure that this is working as hoped, and just come in here with a little extra food just to make sure it continues going well. Because obviously we could tell that it is going quite well. Pretty much what we were hoping for, as far as worms coming over to occupy this space where the moisture is circulating nicely, and food supply is abundant, a good amount of fresh bedding to hang out in and to nibble on. And if you compare it to the old space, all this stuff that they used to live in, this stuff is gradually getting drier and drier, which is something that the worms don't like too much. So every reason to move out and come over into the new space, and pretty much no reason to stay behind. So that's kind of what we're after here, to motivate our worm population to exit this material. And you know, sometimes the mistake I make is, or I don't know about sometime, but I can at least remember one time when I went into a scenario like this. I assumed that I would need to add more food, because I thought that there was probably still tons of worms remaining to complete the process. And after I laid in a bunch of fresh food, I realized there was no more worm population to lure out of the finished compost. So it does seem to me like after we look through here, but maybe prior to adding any more food, we can make our way over into the finished compost area and see how the depopulation of the material is coming along. Because basically, if it's already, you know, almost done, you know, maybe there's not a whole lot of reason to let this continue. Maybe we are finished here. So this I kind of presumptively opened up this opening here, thinking that we are probably going to end up laying a little bit of fresh bedding and food over into that section. But until we do, let's just throw all of this feeding area stuff over in this direction so we can take a look through this compost and see how our migration is progressing. I think my best experience with migrating worms was one where the worms actually exited the finished compost in 18 days. And that's always kind of turned into my sort of record that I want to try to beat someday. And it does seem to me like you could sort of stack the deck in your favor. You can, really let the worms forage in this stuff for a long, long time so they really pick through it, leaving pretty much no food or bedding remaining in it. And perhaps even let the material get to the point where it starts to become a little bit dry and possibly a little bit uncomfortable for the worms to be in. And give them, as many really, really motivating reasons to get out, to move out of the material over to a much more hospitable section of the container. So if I bump into a worm, I'll just help it over to where I'd like it to be instead of leaving it to nature. But I can already see a few as I start to work my way through this stuff, especially down low where the moisture is still abundant. So I guess the other advantage to just doing an inspection here and seeing how things are progressing is that you not only get to see what's happening, but you also get the opportunity to kind of circulate the material around a bit and move some of this more damp stuff that's down low out to the surface where it can get a little bit more air, possibly dry off a little bit further. We can even send some of this pretty dry stuff that's out on the surface down low, or maybe it'll even suck up some moisture of the surrounding damp stuff, all adding to the motivation that we're trying to create for the worms to head over to the feeding area and get collected up for relocation. I guess it does sort of get to the point where it doesn't make sense to sort of stop what you're doing. If what I'm really here to do is sort of agitate the material and just inspect it, all of this picking worms out individually is, it's helping us get to the goal, but it certainly doesn't really gain us much, because for every one that we pull out, we're probably leaving 3 more right in that same spot. And we really want to try to tackle the entire population, get them moved out, get them over into this feeding area. And I think the best way to do that is to help this material get aerated and dried and become less and less hospitable for worms to remain in. Hopefully motivating them to head over to the feeding area, and then at some point soon we'll think about getting them relocated and into a new home. So I think I've more or less stirred up this entire finished compost section, even like bringing up some of these larger chunks of material which are just castings, but they're stuck together because they're wet, a little bit too damp. So this is the stuff that'll benefit from airing out too. It'll help make it crumbly and flow a little bit more readily. And once in a while I pick something up that's not just castings stuck together. It is like a little chunk of leftover food or whatever. I guess it wouldn't hurt to pull that stuff out of here either, because every little bit of food that remains in this stuff, and there's plenty of it, but it all amounts to something that could potentially distract the worms from doing what we want them to do, which is to get on the move, start seeking out a comfortable spot where there's a lot of moisture, a lot of food, and that stuff is right over here. So let's wrap this maintenance session up with just a little bit more bedding and food right over here, and then we'll cover up and let this continue for a little while longer. But I think we've got a really good turnout coming together over here already. But since I don't have food, I've got to run upstairs to the fridge and get some. We're going to take a short break, and I'll be right back. When I was down here yesterday maintaining some of my other worm bins, I came down with a little bit too much food. So I just took what remained and I couldn't make use of yesterday, and I threw it into this paper. Well, it was already in this plastic bag, so I just combined it. They were kind of separate, and this was what seemed to me like just the right amount, a good portion to build up a revamped feeding zone with. And you know, I've been wanting to use some of this freshly ground up cardboard box that I just ran through my brand new shredder, but I got something even better. So this right here is something I introduced kind of informally in my video yesterday. It's kind of the same stuff, it's just shredded cardboard and paper. But in here there's also leaves combined, there's moisture added, there's a little bit of grit sprinkled in, if I remember correctly, and then the magic ingredient is some finished castings in here, sort of helping this damp concoction of different bedding type materials to sort of become really hospitable and cozy for worms to occupy and nibble away at, versus using stuff that was just, you know, freshly shredded and freshly dampened. This stuff is just a little bit better, I would hope. But since I'm brand new to using it, I just started with having an on-demand supply of bedding like this. So I haven't had much experience using it yet, as far as comparing it to sort of sterile, freshly cut up or ground paper. So I'm guessing it's probably going to do pretty good, but I suppose we'll have to see. And then these food items, I'm going to actually do something similar to last time, where we take the somewhat more scrumptious stuff, these pieces of melon rind, and I'm going to use those on the top surface to make them sort of the main attractant up near the surface, since, you know, most of the worms we're dealing with kind of work the top few inches of the material that they inhabit. A lot of times I do assume that stuff happening out near the top surface is probably where a lot of the feeding stuff occurs. Maybe mating too, you know, I don't know. This is kind of leftover food bits here too. Probably also still delicious tasting and smelling from the worm's perspective. But I think a couple nice large chunks of yummy cantaloupe right out here on the surface, hovering right over all this freshly added food and bedding and everything like that, is going to add up to being a really tempting spot for the worms to want to come over and check out and hopefully remain in. So, not much left to do here other than cover back up. Try to do so in a way that protects this stuff from any sort of curious critters that might want to come by and take advantage of a free food supply. Just wondering if I could sort of plug it up, make sure that it's covered quite thoroughly just by having this piece of cardboard on top. I probably could have done a better job submerging the food, but this will be fine too. Can't go wrong with too much bedding, or what you think to be too much bedding, because you can't have too much bedding, right? That's the go-to agreed upon thing amongst all vermicomposters. Even if you can't agree on everything, that's one thing you could generally agree upon. Alright, so here we've just got an old coffee filter. Some coffee still stuck to it on the bottom side. But that's pretty much our update. But yeah, here we are at day 165 after 10 days of migrating. The worms are definitely doing a great job making their way over into the space that we want them in. And just to help it continue and hopefully end successfully soon, we just sweeten the deal by adding some more food, a little fresh bedding, and I assume that over time, as this stuff continues to dry, it's going to keep on motivating our little worm friends to seek out a somewhat more comfortable space to hang out in, and they'll find that right over here beneath the plastic coverings where the moisture is recirculating, making for a really cozy spot. At least as far as worms are concerned, it would be something that the worms consider nice and cozy because of the moisture and the food and everything else, perhaps even the company. So we'll put everything back kind of the way we found it and let it continue, and then maybe in another week or 10 days or maybe 8 days, at which point it'll be 18 days, which was the quickest migration I've ever seen in any of my bins. So it would be interesting on day 18 to see if we're at or near the same point of having all the worms move over out of the finished compost and into the feeding area. But I usually don't hold my breath for those types of results. You would really need optimal conditions for that to happen, and I think then I really did have optimal conditions here. I've got a few things working against me, so I'm not expecting 18 days migration here, but we'll see how long it takes. So that's it for the video today, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated, and if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.